right, well, thanks for coming out, everybody. I have, as Rich said, a particular pet project, pet subject, rather, in history, which is both the Bread and Roses strike, but also the way it has been remembered and forgotten and re-remembered and, variously interpreted over time. My first talk, what was my first talk? Oh, and my first talk this year was about a project involving updating the exhibit in the museum downstairs, which is lacking in coverage of recent history. And so today's talk also involves correcting or filling in a gap on something that is in the permanent exhibit downstairs. Now, I really ought to start, or I want to start by talking about the title of the talk. You know, you schedule these things with Rich, and you have a subject matter, but you want to create a pithy, little catchy phrase for the title. And I keep going back to the phrase, "the strange career," in this case, "the strange career of God and country." And that is a phrase that I stole from one of the most important American history books ever written, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but I thought I ought to explain the background of my usage of that phrase. The book I'm referencing there is called "The Strange Career of Jim Crow." It's written by C. Van Woodward, an important American historian, published in 1955. And in that book, he lays out the history of Jim Crow, which of course is the system of both legal and customary segregation and discrimination that prevailed in the American South through most of the 20th century, and which was embattled at the time he wrote that book by, of course, the rising civil rights movement. And he and a handful of other historians were aware that the popular impression of Southern history, both the Civil War and the post-Civil War period, was incorrect. And one of the defenses that white Southerners used to defend the Jim Crow system of discrimination in the South was by claiming that we've always done it this way. It's always been like this, post-Civil War. And Woodward was well aware that that was simply not true, okay? After the Civil War, of course, we had about a 12-year period known as Reconstruction, in which Northern troops occupied the former Confederate states, enforcing or attempting to enforce the new constitutional amendments, which ended slavery, guaranteed equal rights, supposedly, etc., under which African Americans were able to and did indeed exercise their right to vote, not just voting, but in several cases electing African Americans to state legislatures, to Congress, etc. Contrary to the vision of Reconstruction that Southern historians popularized, claiming that Reconstruction was all about Northern corruption and, oppressing the former slaveholders, etc. There was actual real progress that was being made in terms of achieving equality. In some places in the South, of course, there was massive resistance by many whites, and of course, including violent resistance with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan immediately after the Civil War. But in any case, the equality under the law that African Americans had achieved after the Civil War continued for decades. And even after Reconstruction ended and federal troops were pulled out of the South in 1877 in a notorious compromise over the disputed election of 1876, still African Americans in some places and significant numbers had some degree of equal rights through the 1870s and 80s and so on. But, you know, the forces of white supremacy were gradually gaining more and more power. And then by the 1890s, they really begin to start eliminating what rights African Americans had in the South. And the southern states begin to pass new constitutions, which eliminate black voting rights and other rights and all forms of equality. So that by the early 20th century, 1900 to 1920, an era that's been called the nadir, the low point of civil rights in America, blacks are truly relegated to what I call third-class citizenship in the South. But the point is, it hadn't always been that way. There had been a real effort to create and enforce some degree of equality, contrary to the claims of the defenders of Jim Crow. So Woodward's book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, was widely read, you know, beyond academia and historians, and really revealed to a lot of people that the Jim Crow regime in the South was not something written in stone from ancient times. It was something that was created and enforced and therefore could be uncreated and eliminated. And I often invoke some of the Civil War history and the misinterpretation of history of the Reconstruction era and so on when talking about Bread and Roses and God and Country, because they both involve kind of a dominant narrative of the story that was actually written by the losers, okay? The white power structure in the South, they lost the Civil War, but still they managed to win the battle for historical memory through both academic writings, popular writings, and eventually popular culture in movies like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, which celebrated the lost cause version of Lawrence history, in which the South was this glorious place and the slaves were happy and loyal for the most part, all of which is BS, but they managed to foist that on the whole country, really, for decades. And likewise, in the case of the Bread and Roses strike, the anti-strike forces, who actually lost because the strikers won, but the losing side was able to create and dominate the narrative of the history of the events of 1912 with the God and Country parade and movement, and then the decades under which God and Country, the God and Country version of events, was the dominant, acceptable version of the events of 1912 in public in Lawrence. So you have the there are a number of episodes that I've chronicled before, like in the city's centennial celebration in 1953, they celebrate the God and Country Parade as saving Lawrence from the red blot of the IWW. And likewise, of course, in 1962, in the 50th anniversary of the events of 1912, what's celebrated and recreated on a grand scale is the God and Country Parade. We have another big God and Country Parade in 1962, celebrating that, and little, if anything, is heard about the Bread and Roses strike. And if it is once again portrayed as this shameful episode when the radicals tried to come and take over. That dominant narrative began to collapse starting in the 1970s with the arrival in Lawrence of the artist Ralph Fazzanella, the journalist Paul Cowan, etc., supplemented by historical academic historians who began to write the history from the workers and the strikers' point of view, such that the story of the strike is now kind of the dominant narrative, and a lot of people don't know about the years and decades of the God and Country narrative being the dominant story here in Lawrence. So, a lot of background. What I'm talking about today is documented in this brand new book, which is for sale downstairs, And the book is titled Where Are the Workers? And it's a collection of essays about labor history and how it is portrayed and interpreted in various museums and other historical institutions around America. The editors are Robert Forant and Marianne Tracciati. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. Bob Forant, of course, is a historian at the University of Lowell, who's been very involved in Lawrence history for a number of years. He came in to help us organize the centennial events for the Bread and Roses Strike Centennial in 2012. He's remained very active. He's on the board at the Lawrence History Center, has been for some time. He's the opposite of an academic who just teaches and writes, okay? He's very involved in public history projects of many kinds, but mostly trying to get the story of workers and workers' struggles out there and in the forefront. The other co-editor, Marianne Tracciati, is a professor at Hofstra University, and she's also very involved in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire commemoration, which of course being the tremendous disastrous fire in a garment shop in New York in 1911, in which 146 people were killed. And she's been a major part of their commemorations over the last 10 years or so. So they put out a call for papers. And I, of course, wanted to write about some aspect of the Bread and Roses story and the Garden Country story here in Lawrence. Our friends over at the Lawrence History Center also submitted a proposal for a paper about how they've interpreted both the strike and the Garden Country story over the years. And the editors said, well, we got room for about 12 essays. We can't have, and it's supposed to represent the whole country. 2 out of 12 can't be about Lawrence. So can you work together and combine your essays? And we said, sure, we can do that. But it wasn't that easy because although our subject matters are obviously related, we were both talking about interpretation of the strike and of Garden Country. But the History Center's approach was almost the exact opposite of mine. They wanted to write a broad overview of the History Center's interpretive programming, more or less from the centennial on. And they had a number of excellent programs during the centennial. They had a big exhibit at the Everett Mill. They had a number of programs at the Everett Mill, etc. Great stuff. So certainly they had a story to tell, and they've been, interpreting all of this history since then in their programming. So that was the story they wanted to tell. I wanted to drill, in my essay, my proposal was to drill down on one thing very, very closely. And that was the interpretation of the strike and Garden Country in Lawrence Heritage State Park's permanent exhibit, specifically the permanent exhibit. So that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. The exhibit, if you've seen it, has a panel about the Bread and Roses strike with some pictures and some text. That's on the second floor. Not extensive. I had a friend once say that, this is a museum about the strike. And I said, no, this is a museum about Lawrence. The strike is one element in the permanent exhibit about the strike. Now, it's actually interpreted mostly just in terms of the amount of content, it's interpreted mostly through our videos. All right, we have a number of videos about the strike, one of which is kind of our main attraction in the video room downstairs. It's called Collective Voices, 20-minute documentary. It's very well done. And we've been showing that since 1990 at least, if not since day one of the museum here. So it's very well done. Has a lot of background on the build-up to the strike and industrialization and so on. Does a nice job telling the story of the strike. But it ends with the settlement of the strike. It doesn't say a word about God and Country, about the suppression of the IWW, about driving the activists out of Lawrence, about the blacklisting, et cetera, that took place, or about the 60-odd years in which the God and Country narrative dominated and nobody wanted to talk about bread and roses, or they dare not talk about it favorably. And the revival, the revision that took place in the late 70s, early 80s. That video says nothing about it. It just says, yay, we won the strike, hooray for the workers. And that's basically how it ends. They wanted to tell an uplifting story with a positive message, and so they left it at that. There are a couple of other videos that we have downstairs that we've acquired over the years, one of which focuses on the story of Carmela Tioli, who's the young Italian girl who had a terrible accident in the mill with the machine ripping up part of her scalp, and then who testified at the hearing, the congressional hearing in Washington during the strike, and whose testimony was in some ways the turning point in the strike leading towards the settlement, because it was such a terrible publicity for the mills and the mill owners. So there's one that focuses on her, but again, that ends with the strike. It doesn't talk about the decades of suppression under God and Country. There is one video downstairs which does talk about the God and Country narrative and then how that was finally overturned. And that's a video that was recorded locally by our friends from Methuen Cable, who do some great work creating original programming. And they did a series on museums in the area, and they did a series on Lawrence and some about the Bread and Roses strike, for which I was the narrator, the talking head, and we recorded it here. And in the end, I made sure to reserve the last 5 minutes to talk about the God and Country and how that dominated Lawrence for 60 years and how the strike got revived and revised into a positive story. So there's that. But as far as the exhibit goes, and of course, down on the first floor, the exhibit is a model of downtown Lawrence. Almost nothing about the strike, except for the theater where we show the videos. The second floor is a chronological approach to Lawrence history, and the panel I mentioned earlier, with some text and some photos about the strike, that's near the end of the second floor in an area where there's another video screen where we show another video about the strike. And I should have mentioned this earlier. It is part of the original interpretive program here at the park, and it involves a storyteller portraying a news vendor in a street newspaper booth. Okay, so the storyteller, the screen appears in a mock-up of an old newspaper booth, in a mock-up of what's supposed to be Essex Street with a couple of storefronts. And he comes on talking about initially hawking the newspapers with the Titanic. Titanic, Titanic! Because, of course, the Titanic sank in April of 1912, just months after the strike. So he immediately goes back into relating the story of the strike. And it does a very nice job, except it disappoints some people who think it's really a video about the Titanic. Fortunately, it's not. But again, nothing about God and Country, nothing about the suppression of the strike story or the revival. Then the last part of the exhibit on the second floor, after that strike section, is a series of newspaper front-page mock-ups which whisk you through the rest of the 20th century. with a couple of highlights of events that took place. You know, this mill closed in the 20s, and that highway was built in the 60s, and stuff like that. And you know, it's pretty superficial. It hits some of the important stuff, but there's a lot that's lacking. But when you get to the 1960s, there's one image and caption in particular that I can't ignore. And instead of describing it, I have copies of a photo I took of it. So I want everybody to grab one of these, take a look at the photo and the caption of the photo, and tell me what's wrong with this picture. Should be enough for everybody, but I got a couple more. Oh, that's great. That's fantastic.
Is that really 1960?
62. The 50th anniversary of the events of 1912.
I've seen that many people. Excellent.
Is that all St. Mary's girls? Both
Yes,
phalanxes, if I'm saying that right?
Yes, it is.
Wow.
Oh.
Oh. Oh, what?
It says 1912 strike at the far left.
It does, doesn't it?
Garden Country Parade. Am I missing something? Am I wrong?
What do you think? Is that caption correct? The label? What was the city celebrating in 1962?
What's the date of the article?
I didn't get you.
What's the date of this article?
The date of the, well, see, this is not, the newspaper's not real, okay? The photo and the caption are superimposed. They're not real newspaper headlines. The photo and the caption to the left were not part of the newspaper, in other words. They're raised above it. But the point is, it's from the 1960s.
Close to the future instead of the past.
City celebrates anniversary of 1912 strike. Is that what was being celebrated? Is that what the photo shows? It's the God and Country Parade.
I was right. I wasn't sure.
In the 60s?
What were they celebrating?
St. Patrick's by the looks.
Well, certainly all your Catholic schoolgirls are out there, among others. I mean, it was a massive thing. It wasn't just the St. Mary's girl who were out there.
I think so, because it was
My
a lot of
father-in-law was
Jewish.
out there by Jingo's.
Say what?
My father-in-law was out there by Jingo's, on Garden Country.
I'm sure everybody was.
It's celebrating a previous parade.
Right. It's celebrating the anniversary of the 1912 Garden Country Parade,
Right.
when Lawrence came out to celebrate Garden Country. And oh, by the way, to demonize, marginalize, and drive out the IWW and any foolish immigrant who was dumb enough to follow them.
And what was the name of the Treasury Secretary? Who was
called
the raids? The raids that, what do they call, what was his name?
Oh, Palmer?
Palmer raids.
The Palmer raids. Okay. Which is later. It's 1919. And you know, the IWW had been raided even earlier than that during World War I under the what was it? Sedition Act, the Espionage
Sounds
Act.
familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
I know there was
So,
very strong participation of the Jewish community in this too. You can't see that in this picture.
anybody who was respectable participated in the either participated or came out to watch. It was the thing to do. It was 1962.
Yeah. I was at the Garden Country.
Sure.
But it seemed to me it was mostly on the common, and it was mostly around the flagpole, and it was mostly religious.
Well, there were probably multiple parts to the celebration. There was obviously a huge parade, and it probably ended on the common with a mass.
No.
Or,
No, Matt.
well, that I don't know.
No, because it was a city function. And that's why you got all the St. Mary's girls there, for heaven's sake. But it was more religious than it was strike.
Well, that's the point. It wasn't about the strike. It was about the suppression of the strike.
It was about the establishment.
Right, the powers that be. Now, the interesting thing here, aside from just the fact that it's factually incorrect, is the decisions that were being made by the designers of the exhibit in the early 80s when the exhibit was being designed. Now, at that time, the interpretation of the strike was still in transition. There were obviously thousands of Laurentians who were raised under the God and Country story, and that the strike was a shameful episode in our history. And who are these people coming at these outside radical agitators, just like 1912, coming in and telling us our history, and that the strike was a good thing? So the transition and the acceptance of the new interpretation was very gradual. And it did not go down easy with a lot of people. And there are, letters to the editor and the Tribune and so forth of people who objected to this new portrayal of the strike as something that somehow we're supposed to be proud of. And the folks who designed the exhibit apparently were a little afraid of touching the controversy, okay? I mean, they were living through the height of it. So they made a choice. And the choice was to omit any reference to God and Country and the decades when God and Country was the dominant story. All right. Personally, I tend to favor history, warts and all, so to speak. And if there's a controversy, teach the controversy. Makes it more interesting than a whitewashed version of history that's either all one thing or all the other. So errors of omission. They left out an important part of the Lawrence history story. But this is an error of commission. They actively deceived in writing that caption about a photo that's about something else, which is pretty shocking when I think about it. But I wasn't in their shoes. Now, of course, in writing this, and this is the main theme, or the main thrust of the article, of the half of the article that I wrote in this book, how the God and Country story was left out of the museum, and particularly how it was covered up in the captioning of that photo. And I speculate as to the reasons, the fact that it was so controversial at the time. They just wanted, like the people who created the Collective Voices video, they wanted to tell a positive story, an inspiring story, and kind of ignore the more difficult parts, the parts that would portray some people somewhat negatively, perhaps. So they wanted to leave that out. So in my interpretation in the article about all of the above, I kind of speculate as to the motives because of how controversial it was at the time. Now, I could have done some nuts and bolts research, not just into the records of the exhibit development, but by interviewing some of the principals who were actively involved. So who was involved? The park was being created and designed under the State Department of Environmental Management, okay, the predecessor to DCR. This brand new program, which they call the urban parks or the heritage parks, and which involved expenditures of quite a bit of your state tax money, for sure, and involved hiring professional historians and professional museum designers, but also with input from the local community. There was an advisory committee of people who advised the DEM people and the museum design people about how to tell the story and what should be in and presumably what should be out. And that local committee included people like the late great Eartha Dengler from the Lawrence History Center, and a representative from the mayor's office, which at one point was Gary Keating, and some other folks I don't know. I have that list somewhere, but I don't know if I could put my... Do you know who was on that, Mary?
I'm listening.
All right, okay.
DEM.
Well, again, and this thing is amenable to research, as my sister likes to say. I could have interviewed these people, but like the original park supervisor, who was presumably part of all this, he's still around. But I don't. Maybe I'm like the exhibit designers. I don't want to touch a sore subject or ask tough questions of people like, why did you do that? Why did you lie in the caption of that photo in the exhibit? So I didn't take it that far. I just based my conclusions on a reasonable inference of what their thinking was at the time. Now, I do go on to say in the end of my part of the article that the park does interpret the full story now in our programming. We do that, right, Rich?
What section?
When we do the Bread and Roses strike tours, we talk about God and Country and the suppression and revival. All right, thank you. I'm glad I told the truth when I wrote that. And then, of course, the second half of the article is the History Center's part, in which they lay out in detail how their interpretation, at least since the centennial, but presumably before that, is complete and does teach how the narrative changed over time, how and why that did, and the fact that their programming since then has included, all aspects of the story. But one other interesting thing about the book here, and I have to confess I haven't read all of the other articles in the book, or at least not in detail, but you find some similar stories in some of these other places, wherein big strikes and big radical movements among workers end up being largely suppressed, forgotten, left out of local history. And folks have to make a very strong effort to revive and commemorate these stories. It's eerily similar what's happened in some of these other places.
I just had a shot comment. I really remember reading a lot of this, and my husband actually was involved with a book that was written and also covered another perspective. There was but fortunately this one is less expensive. But the superintendent of schools, Mr. Hennessy, his comments on this were very interesting. And I, that was when I first came back to Lawrence, and I was trying to educate myself, and I wondered, he was very, very patriotic, and how did that affect the students?
Yeah.
And the question of how is it today? Is it
What year, time period are we talking about?
It's actually
Hennessy was 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was this period.
Yeah. Well, that was the dominant narrative. And I was told the story, and I'd love to dig into this. I believe it was Phyllis Tyler, most of you know, told me the story that the director of the library in the mid-'70s, in the lead up to the bicentennial, the National Bicentennial celebrations in 1976, which provided a lot of funding and impetus to the study of local history, that the director of the library was working on a documentary about 1912, but very much the Garden Country. It would have been the Garden Country version of the story, how bad the strike was. Now, I don't know if that ever got completed or if it exists anywhere, but that was obviously still the thinking into the mid-'70s by most people. When the artist Ralph Fasanella came to Lawrence in the mid to late '70s and started asking people about the Bread and Roses strike, he found many people were still not willing to talk about it because it was a bad thing. And likewise, when the Village Voice journalist Paul Cowan came to Lawrence, also in the mid to late '70s, trying to find Carmela Tioli, he also found people were unwilling to talk about it because the strike was still, and participation in the strike was still very shameful to most people.
Do you know who organized the Bread and Roses, the Garden Country Parade? The parade.
The Garden Country, the original?
No.
Or 62?
62? You know who organized it?
I mean, I assume it was all the powers that be in Lawrence, political, business, etc.
Not necessarily. That's why there were more than one Garden Country Parade. All right, to begin with. And the one I remember, father-in-law was in, was a more religious thing. It was organized by a priest or something. All right? Because that's why it was called Garden Country.
Yeah.
It was mainly on the common. And that's why I came to this, because there seems to be more to the story than I ever knew.
Well, no doubt about it. And, at one time, didn't Louise do something on 1962? I think she had a little exhibit at the library about the 62 Garden Country.
So in your research now, you have not a parade. And it wasn't a huge thing.
No, 62.
Mostly a religious, but if I'm thinking of another parade.
You may be. Because the parade in 62 was huge. Military, labor. It's the height of the Cold War. By 62, the IWW, everybody was calling them communists. They'd been conflated with communism in people's minds. Anything, 2 ticks left of center was beyond the pale. Even organized labor was very involved in things like the 62 Garden Country because they had been forced to disavow any connection to the far left from the McCarthy era.
I just can't imagine my father-in-law in that. He would be in the religious one.
It was both. I mean, look at the name, God and Country. They go together.
Right, and that's why I say it was
a certain version of both.
There is a beautiful picture I can't find, of course.
Yeah.
There they were with top hats, and they had, on his float, all right, they had the 3 men with the top hats and so forth. And a relative who was in a uniform, like a World War II uniform, okay? And it was, as I said, it was more, I just can't imagine him in this. I can imagine him It's a religious.
He wouldn't have been wearing a St. Mary's plaid skirt, but there was much more to the parade than...
No, I just wondered if there was more than one garden country parade. That,
Not that I know of.
not that you know.
Not that I know. I mean, other than, of course, the original in 1912. Now, there were times when it was celebrated and commemorated, like at the 1953 City Centennial celebrations, most of which I believe took place at the stadium. They had tableaus where they recreated the scenes of this and that aspect of Lawrence history, which would have included garden country. That wouldn't be a parade per se.
I'm just wondering if there was something else that was post-war, all right? Because that's why they have the military in it, that was called garden country.
It's possible.
You know what I'm saying? And had nothing to do with the anniversary or anything to do with the strike.
Yeah.
Well,
you know, that's actually a good point, because the phrase and the idea garden country is not unique to Lawrence and our garden country parade.
Right.
You see garden country in stone on half of the parochial schools throughout Massachusetts.
So
and it was the motto of the, what's the American Legion?
could be, not in the KSA.
Is the American Legion the veterans organization that came out of World War I? I think so. Who, by the way, acted very much as strike-breaking vigilantes all through the 1920s. So,
That's what happened.
anybody else have a question or a comment? Or want to buy a book?
Actually, our friends from Vermont are in that book.
Yes, our friends from Vermont, Barre, Vermont specifically, which is the home of the Socialist Labor Hall, lovingly restored by the historical community of Barre, Vermont, which of course has a very important Lawrence connection in that a number of the children of the strikers who were sent to stay with sympathizers in various cities, mostly big cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Hartford, but a contingent went to Barre, Vermont, where the granite cutters were very organized in the socialist labor movement. And there is a fabulous photo of about 30 Lawrence kids on the steps of the Labor Hall in Barre, Vermont. And folks from up there have been coming down to the Bread and Roses Festival almost every year for
They are coming.
20, 30 years. That's
They're
fantastic.
coming,
Yeah.
Fantastic library up there.
I haven't been to the
And they
library.
actually have a bakery too. Oh, I'll tell you that really.
Well, the Labor Hall had a bread bakery, so the workers could get cheap bread, and they've rebuilt it.
There currently is a new bread bakery.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Quite a place to visit if you ever get up there.
Oh, and look at the cemetery.
The cemetery is
Oh, the cemetery is unbelievable.
unbelievable.
Anybody else? Comments? Questions? Yes, Linda.
Jim, you mentioned earlier that you had an article that was published in the Boston Globe. Did you have that same article published in the Eagle Tribune?
I'm not sure about a Globe article. What was published recently was a letter to the editor of the Tribune, which appeared on Sunday in response to the latest in the series of articles about the canals. And I just wanted to make the point that the factual correction that they had misidentified the equipment behind me in one of the photos. Those were generators, not turbines.
The Boston Globe, many years ago, was offered to my district, District C. Arlington, at a discount. And it had a lot of good informative and historical and educational articles, but it no longer offers a discount.
Well, you know how you get a discount? You cancel your subscription and read it online.
The paper is priced out of the reach of the common people.
Yeah. Well, that's what your local public library is for. Well, we'll see you next week, folks. Thanks for coming.